Dr. Alex Mercer stood before the reinforced door of the SCP containment unit, his heart thudding against his ribcage like a desperate prisoner. The air was thick with the sterility of the facility, a place where the anomalous and the enigmatic were catalogued and studied. Today he was about to meet one of the most mysterious entities in the Foundation's custody, SCP-014, known colloquially as the Concrete Man. Alex's tenure at the SCP Foundation had been anything but ordinary. From handling transdimensional artifacts to interviewing reality-bending entities, he had thought he was prepared for anything. Yet the file on SCP-014 had left him with a gnawing sense of unease. It wasn't just the sparse information or the cryptic notes from previous researchers. There was something about the stillness, the implied menace of a statue that seemed to defy time and logic. The heavy door slid open with a hiss, revealing a dimly lit chamber. The room was austere, designed to minimize any variables that could influence or be influenced by the anomaly. In the center, surrounded by a lattice of sensors and monitoring equipment, stood SCP-014, the Concrete Man. Alex stepped into the room, the soft hum of machinery his only company. His eyes locked onto the figure, an almost perfectly sculpted man, frozen in a pose that suggested a serene contemplation. The concrete surface was smooth, almost lifelike, but there was an otherworldly quality to it, a subtle wrongness that made his skin crawl. He approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to keep his distance. The documentation had been clear. SCP-014 was inert, immobile. And yet, as he stood there, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His gaze flicked to the statue's eyes, cold and unseeing, yet holding an enigmatic depth that seemed to draw him in. Dr. Mercer, commencing initial observation of SCP-014, he spoke into his recorder, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Subject appears as described in the file. No immediate signs of activity or change. He circled the statue, noting every detail. The craftsmanship was impeccable, each line and curve meticulously rendered. But it was the silence, the profound, almost oppressive stillness that unsettled him. In a facility teeming with noise and movement, SCP-014 was an anomaly in more ways than one. Alex's mind raced with questions. Who or what had created this entity? What purpose did it serve? And most disturbingly, why did he feel such a profound sense of dread in its presence? These were questions that would need answers, but for now he had to focus on the task at hand. Setting up preliminary monitoring equipment, he continued, methodically placing sensors around the room. As he worked, the sense of being watched intensified. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting the statue to have moved, though it remained as still as ever. Hours passed, each one heightening the enigma of SCP-014. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, that the statue held secrets just beyond his grasp. As he finally stepped back to review his setup, he couldn't help but murmur, "What are you hiding?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the Concrete Man stood silent and enigmatic, a puzzle wrapped in mystery. Alex knew his journey with SCP-014 was only beginning, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and perhaps danger. With a final glance at the statue, Alex turned to leave, the door sliding shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the sterile corridor. As he walked away, the image of SCP-014 lingered in his mind, a silent promise of the enigmas yet to be unraveled. Dr. Alex Mercer stood in the dim, humming silence of the containment chamber, his eyes fixed on SCP-014. The Concrete Man stood just as he had left it, an imposing figure carved from lifeless stone. But now, under the sterile fluorescent lights, Alex felt an unsettling chill crawl down his spine. It was as if the very air around SCP-014 was heavier, pressing in on him with an unseen force. He approached the entity with measured steps, each one echoing in the quiet room. The figure's stillness was unnerving. There was an uncanny lifelikeness to the concrete surface, a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on the supernatural. Alex's gaze traveled over the statue's serene, almost contemplative expression, the smooth lines of its body, and the sense of permanence it exuded. Dr. Mercer, beginning detailed examination of SCP-014, he murmured into his recorder, his voice barely a whisper in the oppressive stillness. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from the statue's surface, hesitating. The reports had all stated that SCP-014 was inert, incapable of movement or interaction. Yet, standing this close, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding on something profoundly alien and aware. His fingers finally brushed against the concrete, and a shiver ran through him. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, as if it absorbed the warmth from the very air. He pulled his hand back, flexing his fingers to ward off the numbness that had set in. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening around the edges of the chamber. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand. He circled the statue, meticulously noting every detail, every imperfection. The figure was immaculate, save for a small, almost imperceptible crack running along its left arm. Crack observed on the left arm, he recorded. Possible structural weakness? Further analysis required. His voice sounded detached, clinical, but inside, a storm of unease was brewing. The sense of being watched was back, stronger than before. He glanced up, half expecting to see the statue's eyes following him, but they remained fixed, staring into the void. The minutes dragged on, each one heightening his discomfort. He documented the statue's features, the minute variations in texture, the way the light played off its surface. All the while, the silence pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. Subject remains unresponsive, he noted, trying to keep his voice steady. No signs of activity, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if SCP-014 was drawing the life out of the space around it. He stepped back, eyes still locked on the concrete man. "What are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the entity. The question hung in the air, unanswered, and Alex felt a sudden, irrational urge to flee, to put as much distance between himself and SCP-014 as possible. But he was a scientist, bound by duty and curiosity. He forced himself to stay, to complete his examination. As he turned to leave, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The concrete man stood unchanged, yet Alex couldn't shake the feeling that it had somehow acknowledged him, recognized his presence. The door slid shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing SCP-014 back in its prison. Alex exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. He walked away, the sense of unease lingering, gnawing at the edges of his mind. As he made his way back to his quarters, he couldn't help but wonder what secrets the concrete man held, and what price he would pay to uncover them. The entity's enigmatic stillness haunted him, a silent promise of the mysteries and dangers yet to come. Dr. Alex Mercer sat in his dimly lit office, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system. Before him lay a stack of aged files, each one filled with fragments of information about SCP-014. The concrete man. His fingers traced the edges of the yellowed pages, the weight of the history contained within them pressing down on him. It was time to delve into the past, to uncover the origins of this ancient enigma. The first document was a transcript of an interview conducted in the early 1900s. An unnamed researcher had spoken to an elderly woman who claimed to have seen the concrete man in her youth, standing in a forgotten courtyard of a crumbling estate in rural England. Her descriptions were vivid, almost reverent, as if she had witnessed something divine and terrible. "Describe what you saw," the interviewer had asked, his voice recorded in the neat, spidery script of a bygone era. "It was like a statue," the woman had said, her words trembling on the page, "but not like any statue I've ever seen. It felt alive, watching us with those cold stone eyes. We could never get too close. The air around it was always freezing, even in the summer." Alex shivered, imagining the scene. An ancient estate, long forgotten by time, with the concrete man standing sentinel over its ruins. What power had placed it there? What dark purpose did it serve? He turned to the next file, a series of photographs taken in the 1930s by an amateur explorer. The images were grainy, black and white, showing the concrete man in various locations across Europe. A church in France, a castle in Germany, an abandoned village in Italy. Always the same pose, the same eerie stillness. How had it moved? Who or what had transported it? The mystery deepened with each photograph. Notes scrawled in the margins hinted at strange occurrences: livestock found dead with no visible wounds, villagers disappearing without a trace, whispers of curses and malevolent spirits. Alex's pulse quickened as he pieced together the timeline, the concrete man leaving a trail of dread and death wherever it stood. In the 1950s, a team of researchers had attempted to transport SCP-014 to the United States for further study. The account of their journey was chilling. The ship had been plagued by inexplicable accidents, navigation systems failing, crew members falling ill, the temperature dropping to near freezing levels, despite the summer heat. The concrete man had been chained in the hold, but the crew reported hearing whispers, seeing shadows move, feeling an oppressive weight in their minds. The ship's captain had written a final, desperate entry in his log: "This thing is not of this world. It brings death and madness. I fear we will not reach our destination." The ship had arrived, but only half the crew had survived the voyage. Those who did were never the same, their eyes haunted by visions they refused to describe. Alex leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The history of SCP-014 was a tapestry of terror, each thread woven with fear and death. He felt a deepening sense of foreboding, the weight of the entity's past pressing down on him. He picked up the last file, a recent report from a Foundation agent in South America. The agent had traced SCP-014 to a remote village in the Andes, where it had appeared without warning. The villagers had initially revered it as a deity, but soon the familiar patterns emerged: livestock dying, people disappearing, a pervasive, bone-chilling cold.
The agent's report ended abruptly, with a final, scrawled note: "The statue moved. God help us, it moved."
Alex's hand trembled as he closed the file. The concrete man was not just a relic of the past, it was an active threat, a malevolent force that defied understanding. Its history was a litany of horror, and now it was in his charge. He stared at the stack of files, the stories of dread and death they contained. The air in his office seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. The concrete man's past was a dark, ominous cloud hanging over him, and he knew that uncovering its secrets would come at a cost. As he left his office, the weight of the history he had uncovered followed him, a silent promise of the horrors yet to be revealed. The concrete man was ancient, enigmatic, and terrifying, and its story was far from over. Dr. Alex Mercer's nights had grown longer and more restless. The once sterile corridors of the SCP facility seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, a tension that set his teeth on edge. Every shadow felt deeper, every sound more sinister. He couldn't help but feel that his investigation of SCP-014 had stirred something, like a stone dropped into a stagnant pond, sending ripples of unease through the air. It started with minor anomalies. The lights in the containment wing flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and writhe on the walls. The technical staff dismissed it as a simple electrical fault, but Alex wasn't so sure. He knew the facility's systems were robust, designed to withstand far more than a few power surges. One night, as he reviewed his notes in the dim light of his office, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. He looked up, scanning the empty room. His pulse quickened, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He strained to listen, but the whispering had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence behind. The next morning he found his equipment malfunctioning. The audio recorders picked up strange static, punctuated by low, unintelligible murmurs. The surveillance cameras showed brief, inexplicable distortions, shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Alex reviewed the footage repeatedly, each viewing leaving him more unsettled. These anomalies coincide with my recent interactions with SCP-014, he noted in his log, his voice tight with unease. The entity's influence may extend beyond its immediate vicinity. Further observation is required. As the days passed, the disturbances grew bolder. Staff reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors, cold drafts in sealed rooms, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The facility, once a fortress of logic and order, now felt like a living, breathing organism, its every corner hiding something sinister. One evening, Alex stayed late to run some tests. The facility was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. He was alone in the lab, his colleagues having left hours ago. He focused on his work, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in his gut. A sudden crash shattered the silence. Alex jumped, his heart pounding as he spun around to find the source of the noise. A stack of files had toppled from a shelf, papers scattered across the floor. He approached cautiously, a chill running down his spine. As he knelt to gather the papers, he felt it again, that sense of being watched. He looked up, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He hurriedly gathered the papers and returned to his desk, his hands trembling. Unexplained disturbances continuing, he recorded, his voice barely a whisper. Possible link to SCP-014. Entity's influence may be more extensive than previously documented. The breaking point came a week later. Alex woke in the middle of the night to the sound of his phone ringing. He fumbled for it, his mind still groggy with sleep. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost hysterical. "Dr. Mercer, you need to come to the containment wing. Now." He dressed hurriedly and raced through the deserted corridors, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived, he found a small group of staff huddled near SCP-014's chamber, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Look," one of them whispered, pointing to the observation window. Alex approached slowly, peering into the chamber. His breath caught in his throat. The concrete man stood as it always had, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from a desert floor. And then he saw it, the faintest movement, a slight shift in the statue's posture. "It's impossible," he murmured, but the evidence was right before his eyes. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the temperature dropping rapidly. Alex felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew, without a doubt, that SCP-014 was aware of them, that it was watching, waiting. He stepped back, the weight of the entity's presence almost unbearable. "We need to increase security," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "and we need to figure out what it wants." As he left the containment wing, the whispers followed him, a sinister chorus that echoed in the depths of his mind. The concrete man was no longer just a mysterious artifact. It was a threat, a malevolent force that had awoken from its long slumber. And Alex knew that the worst was yet to come. Dr. Alex Mercer's obsession with SCP-014 grew with each passing day. The concrete man had become an enigma he couldn't ignore, a puzzle that demanded his full attention. The sense of foreboding lingered, a shadow that seemed to cling to him wherever he went. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the way his eyes had taken on a haunted look, but they said nothing. They knew better than to interfere with a man driven by a relentless pursuit of knowledge. Late one night, Alex sat alone in his lab, surrounded by stacks of documents and a web of computer monitors displaying various data feeds. He hadn't slept properly in days, the relentless drive to understand SCP-014 pushing him to the brink of exhaustion. He stared at the screen before him, the flickering light casting eerie shadows across his face. Dr. Mercer, continuing detailed analysis of SCP-014, he recorded, his voice a low murmur. Preliminary data suggests anomalous properties extend beyond physical presence. Psychological influence suspected. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The room felt colder than usual, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that SCP-014 was watching him, its unseen eyes following his every move. The sense of being observed was constant, a nagging presence at the edge of his consciousness. As he reviewed the latest findings, he noticed something peculiar. The sensors placed around SCP-014 had picked up faint electromagnetic pulses, irregular but consistent. It was as if the statue was emitting a signal, a call that resonated with something deep within him. He felt a shiver of excitement mixed with dread. Anomalies detected, he noted. Further investigation required. Possible link to psychological disturbances experienced by personnel. He pulled up the surveillance footage from the past week, his eyes scanning the screens for any sign of movement. The concrete man remained still, but the shadows around it seemed to pulse, as if alive. He rewound the footage, focusing on the moments when the disturbances were most pronounced. His heart raced as he noticed subtle changes in the statue's posture, minute shifts that defied explanation. Subject exhibits signs of mobility, he murmured, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Implications for containment protocols. Risk assessment needed. The hours slipped away as he delved deeper into his research, piecing together fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. SCP-014 wasn't just an inert object, it was an entity with a purpose, a malevolent intelligence that defied the laws of nature. The more he studied it, the more he felt its influence seeping into his mind, a dark presence that whispered in the depths of his thoughts. He paused, staring at the latest analysis. His reflection in the monitor screen looked gaunt, hollow-eyed. He knew he was losing himself, but he couldn't stop. The concrete man had ensnared him, its mystery a siren call he couldn't resist. Personal note, he added, his voice barely a whisper. Subject's influence on mental state increasing. Need to maintain objectivity. But objectivity was slipping away, replaced by a growing obsession. He found himself drawn to SCP-014's chamber at odd hours, standing before the statue, feeling its cold gaze upon him. The air around it seemed to vibrate with a silent power, a force that pulled at the edges of his sanity. One night, as he stood before SCP-014, he thought he saw the statue's eyes flicker, a brief glimmer of awareness. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The room remained silent, the only sound the soft hum of the facility. But in that silence, Alex felt a response, a dark promise that echoed in his mind. He knew then that he was in too deep, that the concrete man had woven itself into his very soul. He returned to his lab, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he was playing with forces beyond his understanding, but he couldn't turn back now. SCP-014 had become his life's work, a dark obsession that consumed his every waking moment. As he pored over his notes, he felt the shadows closing in, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on him. He knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The concrete man watched from its chamber, silent and still, a sentinel of ancient and terrible secrets. And Alex knew that his journey into the heart of the mystery was just beginning, the line between researcher and subject blurring with each passing day. The dark circles under Dr. Alex Mercer's eyes had become permanent fixtures. His obsession with SCP-014, the concrete man, had begun to take a toll on every aspect of his life. The confines of the SCP facility had started to feel like a prison, the walls closing in with each passing day. His colleagues cast concerned glances his way, but no one dared to voice their worries. They had all seen what happened to those who got too close to the anomalies they studied. At home, the strain was even more palpable. His once warm and inviting apartment now felt cold and alien. The cozy evenings spent with his wife, Emily, had been replaced by late-night research sessions and whispered arguments. She had tried to be supportive, but the growing distance between them was undeniable. "Alex, you need to take a break," Emily pleaded one evening as he sat hunched over his laptop at the dining table. Her voice was a mixture of worry and frustration. "You're barely sleeping. You're barely eating. You're obsessed." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The love and concern in her gaze were almost too much to bear. "I'm close to a breakthrough, Emily," he said, his voice strained. "I can't stop now. There's something about SCP-014 that we don't understand. Something important." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "This thing, whatever it is, it's consuming you. You're not the same person anymore. You're haunted." The word struck him like a physical blow. Haunted. He couldn't deny it. The concrete man had wormed its way into his thoughts, its presence a constant, gnawing sensation at the back of his mind. He reached out, taking her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'll try to be better. I promise." But the promises were hollow. Each night he found himself drawn back to his work, the need to understand SCP-014 overpowering everything else. His dreams were plagued by visions of the statue, its cold, unseeing eyes boring into his soul. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers echoing in his mind, fading just as he opened his eyes. His work at the facility suffered too. The meticulous attention to detail that had once defined his research was replaced by frantic scribbles and hasty conclusions. His reports grew erratic, filled with disjointed thoughts and fevered theories. His colleagues began to distance themselves, whispering behind his back, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The only thing that mattered was SCP-014. One particularly cold night, Alex found himself alone in the facility, staring at the concrete man through the observation window. The room was dimly lit, the shadows deep and foreboding. He felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why won't you let me go?" The statue, as always, remained silent and still, but Alex felt its presence more acutely than ever, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. In that moment, he saw Emily's face in his mind's eye, her expression filled with pain and longing. He realized how much he had lost, how far he had drifted from the life they had built together. The concrete man had taken more than just his time and energy, it had stolen his humanity. He stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered. "I can't let it destroy me." With a final, lingering glance at SCP-014, he turned and walked away, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He needed to find a way back to himself, to reclaim the parts of his life that the concrete man had taken. It wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. As he left the facility, the shadows seemed to follow him, a reminder that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had faced the darkness and somehow found the strength to walk away. Emily was waiting for him when he got home, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding on as if his life depended on it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." She hugged him back, her voice soft and comforting. "We'll get through this together, Alex. We'll find a way." But even as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Alex knew that the concrete man was still with him, a dark shadow lurking at the edges of his mind. The journey to reclaim his life would be long and arduous, but he was determined to fight. For himself. For Emily. For the future that SCP-014 had tried to steal. Dr. Alex Mercer's descent into the mystery of SCP-014 had consumed him, but now it was yielding results that defied belief. He sat at his cluttered desk, eyes scanning over ancient documents and newly declassified files, each page a stepping stone deeper into the abyss. The concrete man was more than a relic, it was a relic with a purpose, and Alex was on the verge of uncovering its secrets. The first clue had come from a long-forgotten archive deep within the SCP Foundation's restricted sections. A faded manuscript, written in Latin, detailing the worship of a stone deity by a cult in ancient Rome. The text described a statue with an uncanny resemblance to SCP-014, revered and feared for its ability to bestow knowledge and madness in equal measure. The cult of the concrete god, Alex read aloud, his voice tinged with awe and trepidation. Believed to hold the secrets of the universe, but at a terrible cost, he traced the lines with his finger, feeling a chill as he read the accounts of sacrifices made to the stone figure, of minds broken and lives destroyed. The deeper he dug, the more connections he found. Across different cultures and epochs, the same entity appeared: a stone man, silent and still, yet possessing an unearthly power. From the temples of Mesoamerica to the monasteries of medieval Europe, the concrete man had been there, a constant and malevolent presence. Each civilization saw it as something different, he mused, scribbling notes furiously. A god, a demon, a harbinger of doom. But the effects were always the same: knowledge at the price of sanity. His research took him to places he had never imagined. He hacked into classified databases, bribed informants, and even consulted with fringe occultists. Each step brought him closer to understanding the true nature of SCP-014, but it also brought him closer to the edge. He began to hear the whispers more frequently, feel the cold presence of the concrete man, even when he was miles away from the facility. It was during one of these dark, solitary nights that he stumbled upon a recording, buried deep within the Foundation's digital archives. The video was grainy, the timestamp marking it as over 70 years old. In it, a group of scientists conducted an experiment on SCP-014, their faces drawn and pale. They spoke of unlocking the statue's secrets, of peering into the depths of its power. Alex watched, transfixed, as the experiment unfolded. The scientists recited incantations, their voices trembling. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening. And then SCP-014 moved. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to send the researchers into a frenzy. The video cut off abruptly, the final frames showing the terrified faces of the scientists as the room plunged into chaos. Further analysis of the recording reveals electromagnetic interference, he noted, his hand shaking. SCP-014 reacts to specific stimuli, possibly incantations or rituals. The implications are vast. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. SCP-014 wasn't just a statue, it was a conduit, a bridge to something far darker and more powerful than he had ever imagined. The ancient cults had been right to fear it, to keep its secrets hidden. Driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Alex knew he had to continue. He had to uncover the full extent of SCP-014's power, to understand the entity that lurked within its stone shell. But as he delved deeper, the whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. He felt his sanity slipping, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. One night, as he pored over yet another ancient text, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, heart pounding, to see SCP-014 standing in the corner of his office. It was impossible, the statue was locked in its chamber. But there it was, its cold eyes staring into his soul. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The statue remained silent, but Alex felt an answer in his mind, a dark promise of knowledge and madness intertwined. In that moment, he realized the true horror of SCP-014. It wasn't just a relic of the past, it was an active, malevolent force, reaching out across time and space to ensnare those who sought its secrets. And Alex was its latest victim. He turned back to his desk, determined to continue his research. He knew the cost, knew the dangers, but he couldn't stop. The concrete man had him in its grasp, and he was powerless to resist. As he plunged deeper into the abyss, the line between researcher and subject blurred, and the darkness closed in around him. The concrete man watched, silent and still, as Alex's mind unraveled. The secrets it held were tantalizingly close, but the price was his soul, and in the end, SCP-014 would claim him, just as it had claimed so many before. Dr. Alex Mercer's obsession with SCP-014 had reached a fever pitch. His days and nights blurred into a single, endless quest for understanding, punctuated by the ever-present whispers and the growing sense of dread. His colleagues watched him with a mix of pity and fear, their once sterling opinion of him tarnished by his descent into madness. He was becoming a cautionary tale, the brilliant researcher undone by his own curiosity. It was late one night when he received a call that cut through his haze of obsession. Dr. Margaret Holt, a respected senior researcher and one of the few who still cared enough to intervene, had asked to meet him in her office. Her voice had been tight, urgent, carrying an edge that Alex couldn't ignore. He found her sitting behind her desk, her expression grave. The office was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners. As he entered, she gestured for him to sit. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What is it, Margaret?" Alex replied, trying to mask the irritation in his voice. He had work to do, and this felt like an unnecessary distraction. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "It's about SCP-014. You need to stop. This research is consuming you, and it's dangerous. You're not the first to fall into this trap, and you won't be the last if you don't heed my warning." Alex scoffed, shaking his head. "I'm close to something big, Margaret, you know that. The secrets SCP-014 holds could change everything we know about the Foundation, about the anomalies." "And at what cost, Alex?" she snapped. "Look at yourself. You're barely holding it together. The whispers, the hallucinations, they're signs that SCP-014 is affecting you more deeply than you realize." Her words stung because they were true. He could feel the entity's influence seeping into his mind, twisting his thoughts, but he couldn't stop. "Not now. I can handle it," he insisted, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. Margaret sighed, leaning back. "Listen to me. I've seen this before. Researchers who get too close to SCP-014 don't just lose their minds, they lose their lives. You need to distance yourself before it's too late." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker. Alex felt the weight of her words, the truth they carried, but he also felt the pull of SCP-014, a siren call that promised answers, even as it threatened his sanity. "I appreciate your concern, Margaret," he said finally, his voice softening. "But I can't walk away. Not yet. I need to understand." She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "Then at least take precautions. Don't go in alone. Don't let it consume you. Promise me that." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. The path he was on felt inevitable, a descent into darkness that he couldn't escape. But he agreed, if only to ease her worry. Leaving her office, he felt the familiar weight of SCP-014's influence pressing down on him. The facility's corridors were silent, the air thick with an unspoken menace. He made his way back to his lab, the shadows following him like a specter. That night, as he reviewed his notes, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could almost make out words, fragments of sentences that danced at the edge of his understanding. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath visible in the frigid air. In the depths of his mind, he felt SCP-014's presence, a dark and malevolent force that promised knowledge at the price of his soul. He knew Margaret was right, that he was teetering on the edge of an abyss. but he couldn't stop. The need to understand, to uncover the entity's secrets, was too strong. As he scribbled frantically in his notebook, a sudden crash echoed through the lab. He looked up to see the shelf of equipment toppling over, the contents spilling across the floor. He froze, the cold hand of fear gripping his heart. He wasn't alone. Slowly he turned, half expecting to see SCP-014 standing there, its stone eyes watching him. But the room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe with a life of their own. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm him. He clutched his head, trying to shut them out, but they persisted, relentless and insidious. In that moment he realized the true extent of SCP-014's power. It wasn't just a statue, it was a conduit for something far darker, a presence that reached into his mind and twisted it to its will. He had to find a way to fight it, to reclaim his sanity before it was too late. But as he looked at the scattered equipment and felt the shadows closing in, he knew that the battle would be long and arduous. Margaret's warning echoed in his mind, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He had to hold on to his humanity, to resist the pull of the concrete man, even as it sought to consume him. With a trembling hand, he picked up his pen and continued to write, the shadows watching, waiting. The fight was just beginning, and Alex knew he was in for the battle of his life. Dr. Alex Mercer's sleep had become a battleground. Each night he plunged into a world of vivid, terrifying nightmares where the line between reality and illusion blurred. The concrete man haunted his dreams, its cold, unseeing eyes a constant presence that pierced through the fabric of his subconscious. In one such nightmare, Alex found himself standing in a desolate landscape. The ground was cracked and dry, the sky a swirling mass of dark clouds. SCP-014 stood at the center of this wasteland, its form towering and ominous. As he approached, the statue seemed to grow, its shadow stretching out to engulf him. The whispers began, low and insidious, rising from the cracked earth like tendrils of smoke. Alex. Alex, the voices were familiar, the echoes of his own thoughts twisted and distorted. He tried to turn away, but his feet were rooted to the spot, as if the very ground had come alive to hold him in place. The concrete man's eyes seemed to follow him, a dark promise hidden within their depths. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he spun around to see Emily, her face pale and drawn. "You need to stop," she whispered, her voice filled with a sorrow that cut through him like a knife. "It's tearing us apart." He reached out to her, but she dissolved into mist, her form scattered by the rising wind. The landscape shifted, the ground opening up beneath him. He fell into darkness, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. "Knowledge at the price of your soul. The truth awaits." He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, the shadows deep and foreboding. He could still hear the echoes of the whispers, fading as he blinked away the remnants of sleep. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, as if SCP-014's presence had followed him from the dream world into reality. "Another nightmare," he muttered to himself, running a trembling hand through his hair. "It's getting worse." He knew he needed to talk to someone, but who would understand? His colleagues were wary of him, and Emily was growing more distant each day. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The cold floor beneath his feet grounded him, but the sense of dread lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the concrete man was always with him, a silent observer waiting for the moment to strike. In the following days, the nightmares intensified. Each time he closed his eyes, he was drawn back to the same desolate landscape, the same haunting presence. He began to dread sleep, the prospect of facing SCP-014 in his dreams more terrifying than the exhaustion that came with insomnia. He tried to distract himself with work, burying himself in research and analysis. But even in the bright, sterile environment of the lab, the shadows seemed to creep closer, the whispers more insistent. He saw SCP-014's image in the data, felt its influence in the erratic behavior of his equipment. One evening, as he reviewed yet another batch of data, he noticed something odd. The electromagnetic readings he had been monitoring showed a pattern, a rhythmic pulse that matched the cadence of his nightmares. It was as if SCP-014 was reaching out to him, using the electromagnetic field to bridge the gap between their worlds. Subject exhibits influence beyond physical presence, he recorded, his voice shaking. Possible connection between EM anomalies and psychological disturbances. Further investigation required. But how could he investigate without losing himself completely? He was already on the brink, his mind fraying under the relentless assault of the concrete man. He needed help, but he couldn't trust anyone within the Foundation. The risks were too great. That night, he resolved to take a different approach. He set up a video camera beside his bed, hoping to capture some evidence of the entity's influence. If he could prove that SCP-014 was affecting him even in his sleep, perhaps he could convince the Foundation to reassign the case. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt the familiar pull, the darkness closing in around him. The nightmare world awaited, but this time he was prepared. He focused on the camera, the cold, unblinking eye that would record everything. In his dream, he stood once more in the desolate landscape. SCP-014 loomed before him, its presence more oppressive than ever. The whispers began, but he forced himself to focus, to remember that this was just a dream. "I will understand you," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty expanse. "I will uncover your secrets." The ground shook, and the sky darkened further, but Alex stood his ground. The concrete man's eyes seemed to flare with a dark light, and he felt a wave of fear crash over him. But he held on, his will stronger than the entity's influence. When he awoke, the camera was still running. He replayed the footage, his heart racing. The video showed him tossing and turning, his face contorted in fear. But in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing by his bed. SCP-014. "It's real," he whispered. A mix of terror and triumph flooding through him. "It's all real." He knew then that he had to confront SCP-014 directly. The nightmares were just the beginning. The concrete man held the key to something far greater, a dark knowledge that could change everything. And Alex was determined to unlock its secrets, no matter the cost. With renewed resolve, he prepared for the battle ahead. The concrete man had invaded his mind, but Alex would fight back. He would uncover the truth, even if it meant facing his worst fears. The journey into darkness was far from over, but Alex was ready. The nightmares had given him the strength to confront the entity, and he would not back down. The final confrontation was coming, and Alex knew he had to be prepared. The line between reality and nightmare was thin, but he would walk it, driven by the need to understand the concrete man and its unearthly power. The fight for his soul had begun, and Alex was determined to emerge victorious. Dr. Alex Mercer's struggle against SCP-014 had become a waking nightmare. Each day he felt the concrete man's grip tightening around his mind, a vice of cold, unrelenting pressure. It wasn't just the whispers that haunted him now, but a tangible influence over his actions, a sinister force manipulating his will. He sat in his lab, staring blankly at the monitor in front of him. The data was a blur, incomprehensible numbers, and graphs that seemed to mock his efforts. He tried to focus, to regain control, but his thoughts were not his own. They were twisted, reshaped by SCP-014's insidious presence. "Dr. Mercer, are you all right?" The voice came from his assistant, Dr. Lisa Carter, who had noticed his deteriorating condition. Her eyes were filled with concern, her brow furrowed as she studied his pale, drawn face. Alex forced a smile, though it felt like a mass cracking. "I'm fine, Lisa. Just a bit tired." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. If you need anything, let me know. We're all worried about you." As she walked away, Alex felt a pang of guilt. He knew they were worried, and they had every right to be. He was slipping away, losing himself to the concrete man's influence. But he couldn't tell them the truth, couldn't admit that SCP-014 was controlling him. That night, as he lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just echoes in his mind anymore, they were commands, directives he couldn't ignore. "Go to the containment chamber," the voice urged, a dark compulsion that gripped his soul. "Unlock the secrets." He tried to resist, but his body moved of its own accord. He rose from the bed, his movements stiff and robotic, his mind screaming in silent protest. He dressed quickly, barely aware of what he was doing, and left his apartment, the streets outside deserted and eerie in the pale glow of the streetlights. The journey to the SCP facility was a blur. He arrived at the containment wing, his heart pounding, the whispers guiding him to SCP-014's chamber. He swiped his access card, the door sliding open with a hiss. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the monitoring equipment. The concrete man stood in the center, its presence overwhelming. Alex felt a surge of fear and awe as he approached, his mind struggling against the compulsion that drove him forward. "Unlock the secrets," the voice repeated, an echo that reverberated through his entire being. He reached out, his hand trembling as it touched the cold surface of the statue. In that instant, a flood of images and sensations overwhelmed him. He saw ancient rituals, felt the terror of those who had come before him, their minds broken by the entity's dark power. He heard the screams of the sacrifices, their agony a chorus that echoed through time. The world spun, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head. The concrete man's influence was inside him now, a part of him, and he could feel its malevolent intelligence probing his thoughts, searching for something. "Join us," the whispers urged, a seductive promise of knowledge and power. "Become one with us." Alex's mind teetered on the brink of madness. He knew he had to fight, had to resist, but the entity's hold was too strong. He felt his will slipping away, his consciousness merging with the darkness that was SCP-014. But even in the depths of despair, a spark of defiance remained. He thought of Emily, of her love and support, and it gave him the strength to push back against the entity's control. "No," he whispered, his voice weak but determined. "I won't let you take me." The struggle was intense, a battle of wills that raged within his mind. He could feel SCP-014's frustration, its anger, but he held on, using every ounce of his strength to keep his sanity intact. Finally, the pressure eased, the whispers fading to a distant murmur. Alex collapsed on the floor, his body shaking, his mind exhausted. He had won this round, but he knew the fight was far from over. He staggered to his feet, his vision blurry. He had to get out of there, had to put distance between himself and SCP-014. He stumbled to the door, his movements unsteady, and made his way back to the main part of the facility. As he walked, he felt the entity's presence receding, its grip on his mind loosening. But the damage had been done. He knew that SCP-014 had left a mark on him, a dark seed that could grow at any moment. Back in his office, he slumped into his chair, his mind racing. He had to find a way to break free from the concrete man's influence, to destroy its power before it consumed him completely. But how? He glanced at his notes, the fragments of information he had gathered over the months. There had to be something, some clue that could help him. He would keep fighting, keep searching for a way to defeat SCP-014. But as he sat there, the shadows deepening around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the concrete man was watching, waiting for the next moment to strike. The battle for his soul was far from over, and the darkness was closing in. Dr. Alex Mercer's grip on reality was slipping. Days turned into nights in an endless blur, his mind a battleground where sanity and madness clashed with relentless fury. The influence of SCP-014, the concrete man, had permeated every aspect of his life, and he could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the entity's insidious whispers. He wandered the corridors of the SCP facility, his eyes hollow, his movements erratic. Colleagues avoided him, their pity and fear palpable. They spoke in hushed tones, their words carrying a weight of doom that pressed down on him like a leaden shroud. "Alex, you need to take a break," Dr. Lisa Carter pleaded one morning, her voice trembling with concern. "This obsession is destroying you. Please just step back for a while." He stared at her, uncomprehending. The words reached him, but their meaning was lost in the cacophony of whispers that filled his mind. "I can't," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I'm so close. I just need to understand." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "You're not the same person anymore. The Alex I knew wouldn't sacrifice his sanity for this. Please, for your own sake, let it go." He turned away, unable to face her. He knew she was right, but the pull of SCP-014 was too strong, its influence a dark tide that swept him along, deeper into the abyss. His office had become a shrine to madness. Papers were strewn everywhere, covered in frantic scribbles and diagrams that made sense only to him. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and desperation. He hadn't slept in days, and the lack of rest was wearing on him, his thoughts fragmented and chaotic. The nightmares had become more vivid, bleeding into his waking hours. He would see SCP-014 standing in the corners of rooms, lurking in the shadows, its cold eyes following him. He heard the whispers, even when he was awake, their insidious suggestions warping his perception of reality. One evening, as he sat hunched over his desk, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He jerked up, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the oppressive stillness of the room, the shadows deepening as the last light of day faded. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself, but the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "The secrets are within your grasp," they hissed. "Just surrender to us, and all will be revealed." He slammed his fists on the desk, the sound echoing in the silent room. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I won't let you take me." But the fight was becoming harder. Each day, SCP-014's influence grew stronger, its hold on his mind tightening. He felt himself slipping, his thoughts no longer his own. The line between reality and nightmare was gone, leaving him adrift in a sea of madness. He knew he needed help, but he couldn't trust anyone. The Foundation was full of secrets and dangers, and he feared what they might do if they discovered the extent of his connection to SCP-014. He was alone in this battle, a solitary warrior against an ancient and malevolent force. Desperate, he turned to the only source of hope he had left. He dug through his notes, searching for a fragment of information that could save him. He found references to ancient rituals, to incantations that might sever the bond between him and the concrete man. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He gathered the materials, his hands shaking. He drew the symbols, muttered the words, his voice a trembling whisper in the dark. He felt a surge of power, a brief moment of clarity, and then the shadows closed in again, thicker and more oppressive. "Please let this work," he prayed, his voice breaking. "I can't go on like this." The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. He felt a presence behind him, a dark, malevolent force that radiated pure evil. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and there it was, SCP-014, standing in the center of the room, its eyes glowing with a dark light. The whispers crescendoed, a cacophony that drowned out his thoughts. "Join us," they urged, their tone both seductive and terrifying. "Embrace the darkness." Alex fell to his knees, his mind fracturing under the onslaught. He couldn't fight it anymore, couldn't hold on to his sanity. The darkness was overwhelming, and he felt himself slipping, his consciousness merging with the entity's malevolent will. But even in the depths of madness, a small spark of defiance remained. He clung to it, using it as a lifeline, a beacon in the darkness. He would not surrender, would not let SCP-014 consume him completely. With a final, desperate effort, he pushed back, forcing the entity out of his mind. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, and he collapsed on the floor, exhausted but victorious. For now. He knew the battle was far from over. SCP-014 was still out there, its dark influence ever present. But he had won this round, had held on to his sanity by the thinnest of threads. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind a fragile thing, balanced on the edge of madness. He would continue to fight, to resist the concrete man's influence, but he knew the price would be high. The descent into madness had begun, and Alex was determined to find a way out, no matter the cost. He would uncover SCP-014's secrets, but he would not let it destroy him. The battle for his soul was just beginning, and he would face it with every ounce of strength he had left. Dr. Alex Mercer sat in the darkened confines of his office, the glow of his computer screen casting eerie shadows across his face. The fight against SCP-014, the concrete man, had left him battered and worn, but a burning need for answers drove him forward. The entity's hold on his mind was a constant pressure, but in his darkest hours he had found fragments of the truth. Weeks of relentless research and analysis had led him to a realization that chilled him to the bone. SCP-014 was more than a mere statue, it was a conduit, a vessel for an ancient and malevolent intelligence. This entity had existed for millennia, moving through time and space, manipulating those who came into contact with it. The pieces fell into place one by one. The whispers, the nightmares, the hallucinations, these were not random phenomena. They were the entity's attempts to communicate, to exert its will on the living. Alex's frantic scribbles and fevered notes had coalesced into a horrifying picture. SCP-014 was a key, a gateway to something far darker and more powerful. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The ancient texts, the classified documents, the occult symbols, they all pointed to one thing: a ritual, a way to unlock the full potential of SCP-014. But it wasn't a simple key to knowledge. It was a doorway to an apocalyptic force, a darkness that sought to consume the world. He closed his eyes, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He had always known the risks, the dangers of delving too deeply into the mysteries of the Foundation. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The subject possesses an intelligence far greater than previously documented, he whispered into his recorder. Its purpose is not merely to exist, but to bring forth an ancient darkness, a force that could unravel reality itself. His hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water, the liquid trembling as he lifted it to his lips. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to think, to plan. The entity's influence was growing stronger, and time was running out. Suddenly, the door to his office burst open, and Dr. Lisa Carter stormed in, her face a mask of fear and determination. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, her voice urgent. "I've been going through your notes. What the hell is going on?" He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "Lisa, you don't understand. SCP-014. It's a gateway. It's not just a statue. It's a conduit for something ancient, something evil. We have to stop it." She stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and horror. "A gateway? Alex, that's insane. What are you talking about?" He stood, his movements frantic as he gathered his notes, shoving them into her hands. "Read these. The rituals, the symbols. It all points to a being, an entity that's been using SCP-014 as a means to cross over into our world. We have to stop it before it's too late." Lisa glanced at the papers, her eyes widening as she skimmed the contents. This is madness. But if you're right, then we're all in danger. What do we do?" Alex took a deep breath, his mind racing. We have to destroy it. The ritual. It can be reversed. We need to find a way to sever the connection, to shut the gateway before it's fully opened. But how? Lisa asked, her voice shaking. What if we're too late? He looked at her, his expression grim. Then we fight. We do whatever it takes to stop this entity from crossing over. We can't let it win. Together, they hurried to the containment chamber, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. As they approached SCP-014, Alex felt the entity's presence stronger than ever, a dark force that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. He set up the equipment, his hands moving with a precision born of desperation. Lisa watched, her face pale as he drew the symbols, recited the incantations. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers more insistent. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "No," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But we have no choice." The room seemed to pulse with energy as he completed the ritual, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. SCP-014 stood silent and still, but Alex could feel the entity's fury, its frustration at being thwarted. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was eerily quiet, the tension almost unbearable. Then, slowly, the shadows began to recede, the air growing warmer. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. Alex staggered back, his body shaking with exhaustion. "Did it work?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lisa approached SCP-014, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I think so. The connection. It feels weaker. You did it, Alex." He nodded, relief washing over him. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. The entity was still out there, waiting for its chance. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. As they left the chamber, Alex felt a sense of determination settle over him. He would continue to fight, to resist the darkness that sought to consume the world. The revelation had shown him the true nature of SCP-014, and he would do whatever it took to stop it. The concrete man had been revealed, its secrets laid bare. But the cost had been high, and the journey was far from over. Alex knew that he had to stay vigilant, to protect the world from the ancient evil that lurked within SCP-014. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The battle for the future had begun, and Alex was ready to face whatever came next. Dr. Alex Mercer stood in the dimly lit corridor outside the containment chamber, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle with SCP-014 had reached a critical point. He knew the entity wouldn't go down without a fight, and the stakes had never been higher. The ritual had weakened the connection, but the concrete man's influence was still a palpable presence, a dark force that threatened to consume everything in its path. Beside him, Dr. Lisa Carter adjusted the straps on her equipment pack, her face set with grim determination. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Alex nodded, his grip tightening on the ritual dagger he held. "As ready as I'll ever be. We have to end this, Lisa, no matter what it takes." They pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped into the containment chamber. The air was thick with a suffocating cold, the shadows deep and menacing. SCP-014 stood at the center, its stone eyes seemingly alive with a malevolent intelligence. Alex could feel the entity's rage, its fury at being challenged. "Stay close," he whispered to Lisa. "We have to complete the reversal ritual. It's our only chance." They moved cautiously, setting up the candles and drawing the symbols on the floor with chalk. The air seemed to vibrate with energy, a low hum that resonated in their bones. Alex could hear the whispers growing louder, the entity's voice a cacophony of anger and defiance. "Foolish mortals," the whispers hissed. "You cannot defeat me. I am eternal." Ignoring the voice, Alex focused on the task at hand. He began to chant the incantation, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Lisa joined in, their voices blending together in a desperate attempt to sever the connection once and for all. The ground beneath them trembled, cracks spidering out from SCP-014's base. The statue seemed to pulsate with a dark light, the air growing colder with each passing second. Alex could feel the entity's power surging, a wave of malevolent energy that threatened to overwhelm them. "Keep going," he shouted over the rising din. "We're almost there." But the entity was not about to go quietly. The shadows in the room coalesced into dark, writhing shapes, tendrils of darkness reaching out to ensnare them. One of the tendrils wrapped around Alex's leg, pulling him to the ground. He cried out, his chant faltering as the cold seeped into his bones. "Alex," Lisa screamed, rushing to his side. She slashed at the tendril with her ritual dagger, the blade glowing with a faint, ethereal light. The darkness recoiled and she helped him to his feet, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to finish this," she urged, her voice cracking. "It's our only chance." Drawing on his last reserves of strength, Alex resumed the chant, his voice rising above the chaos. He could feel the entity's grip weakening, the tendrils of darkness retreating. The statue began to crack, pieces of stone falling away to reveal a swirling vortex of energy within. The room shook violently, the force of the entity's rage almost too much to bear. But they pressed on, their voices unwavering. With a final desperate push, Alex completed the incantation, the last words echoing through the chamber. There was a blinding flash of light, and a deafening roar filled the air. The ground buckled, and Alex felt himself being thrown backward, the force of the explosion knocking the breath from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. When the light faded, the chamber was eerily quiet. Alex struggled to his feet, his body aching. The statue was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. The swirling vortex had vanished, and the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence lifted. "We did it," Lisa said, her voice filled with relief. "We actually did it." Alex nodded, his heart still racing. They had won, but the cost had been high. He knew the entity wasn't truly gone, merely banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. But for now, the immediate threat was over. "We need to secure the site," he said, his voice hoarse. "Make sure it can't come back." Lisa nodded, and they set to work, sealing the chamber and reinforcing the containment protocols. The Foundation would need to know what had happened, and they would need to be prepared for any future threats. As they left the chamber, Alex felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But the scars of the battle would remain, a reminder of the price they had paid to protect the world from the ancient evil of SCP-014. The fight was far from over, but they had won this battle. And Alex knew that, whatever the future held, he would be ready to face it, armed with the knowledge and determination that had carried him through this harrowing ordeal. The concrete man had been defeated, but the war against the darkness was just beginning. Dr. Alex Mercer stood at the edge of the containment chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fight against SCP-014 had taken everything from him. His body was battered, his mind on the brink of collapse, but he had one last chance to end the threat for good. The entity had been banished, but the gateway remained, a festering wound in reality that could still be reopened. Lisa Carter looked at him, her face pale and drawn. "Alex, there has to be another way," she pleaded. "We can find a solution together. We've come this far." He shook his head, a grim determination in his eyes. "No, Lisa. This is the only way to ensure it's gone for good. I have to seal the gateway from the inside. It's the only way to make sure it never comes back." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded, understanding the gravity of his decision. "I'll help you prepare," she said, her voice breaking. They worked in silence, gathering the materials for the final ritual. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of the impending sacrifice pressing down on them both. Alex knew what he had to do, and he was at peace with his choice. He had seen the horrors SCP-014 could unleash, and he couldn't allow it to threaten the world again. As they completed the preparations, Alex turned to Lisa. "You need to leave the chamber before I start the ritual. It's not safe for you to be here." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you, Alex. Not now." He reached out, taking her hand. "Please, Lisa, I need you to survive, to tell the Foundation what happened, to make sure this never happens again." She sobbed, tears streaming down her face, but she nodded. "I'll do it. I promise." With a final, lingering look, she turned and left the chamber, the heavy door sliding shut behind her. Alex stood alone in the dim light, the silence almost deafening. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He began the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The symbols on the floor glowed with an ethereal light, the air crackling with energy. He felt the presence of SCP-014, a dark shadow lurking at the edge of his consciousness. As the ritual progressed, the gateway began to shimmer, a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Alex could feel the entity's rage, its desperation to break free. But he was ready. He had to be. The final part of the ritual required a sacrifice, a life given to close the gateway permanently. He knew what he had to do. He raised the ritual dagger, the blade glinting in the eerie light. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of anger and defiance. "You cannot defeat me," the entity hissed. "You are nothing." Alex ignored the voice, his resolve unshaken. He had made his choice. He plunged the dagger into his chest, the pain sharp and immediate. Blood flowed, mingling with the glowing symbols on the floor. The gateway shuddered, the vortex tightening as the energy from his sacrifice poured into it. Alex fell to his knees, his vision blurring, but he kept chanting, his voice strong despite the agony. The shadows closed in, but he didn't stop. With a final, triumphant cry, he completed the ritual. The gateway collapsed, the vortex imploding with a deafening roar. The chamber was plunged into darkness, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence lifting. Alex lay on the floor, his body growing cold, but he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done it. He had stopped SCP-014. The world was safe. As his vision faded, he heard the door to the chamber open, and Lisa's voice calling his name. He smiled, knowing she would be okay, knowing he had done what was necessary. "Goodbye, Lisa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Keep them safe." The darkness took him, and he felt no more pain. He had given everything to protect the world, and it was enough. Lisa rushed to his side, her tears falling on his still face. She took his hand, holding it tightly, her heart breaking. But she knew he had done what he had to. He had saved them all. She would tell his story, ensure that the Foundation knew of his sacrifice, and she would make sure that SCP-014 remained sealed, a dark memory that would never threaten the world again. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. Alex's sacrifice would not be forgotten. He had given his life to protect the future, and his legacy would live on in the hearts of those he had saved. The containment chamber was quiet, the air heavy with the echoes of sacrifice and loss. Dr. Lisa Carter stood alone, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her shoulders. The ritual had worked, the gateway was sealed, and SCP-014 was no more. But the price had been high. Alex Mercer, her colleague and friend, was gone, his life given to protect the world from an ancient evil. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move. There was work to be done, and she had to ensure that Alex's sacrifice was not in vain. The Foundation needed to know what had happened, and precautions had to be taken to prevent anything like this from occurring again. Lisa walked through the corridors of the SCP facility, the once familiar environment now tinged with an unsettling silence. Colleagues glanced at her with a mix of sympathy and fear, their whispered conversations trailing off as she passed by. She made her way to the central command, where the leadership team was waiting for her report. Dr. Andrew Summers, the head of the containment division, met her at the entrance. His expression was grave, his eyes reflecting the same weariness she felt. "Lisa, we've been waiting. Please tell us what happened." She nodded, stepping into the room where the senior staff had gathered. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension palpable. Taking a deep breath, she began her account, detailing the events that had led to the final confrontation with SCP-014. "The entity was far more than we initially understood," she explained. "It wasn't just an artifact, it was a conduit for an ancient intelligence, a malevolent force that sought to enter our world. Alex discovered the true nature of SCP-014 and realized that the only way to stop it was to perform a reversal ritual from within the gateway." The room was silent as she spoke, the gravity of her words sinking in. She recounted the preparation, the final moments of the ritual, and Alex's ultimate sacrifice. Her voice faltered when she described his final act, the image of him lying on the floor, his life ebbing away, still fresh in her mind. "He gave everything to protect us," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to honor his sacrifice by ensuring that this never happens again. The site needs to be secured, and we need to learn from this." Dr. Summers nodded, his expression somber. "We will, Lisa. Alex's sacrifice won't be forgotten. We'll take every measure to secure the site and ensure that no other anomalies pose a similar threat." The meeting concluded, and Lisa left the room, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. The Foundation would take the necessary steps, but the scars of this encounter would remain with her forever. She made her way to her office, needing a moment to herself. Sitting at her desk, she stared at the photograph of her and Alex taken during happier times. His smile was infectious, his eyes full of life and curiosity. She felt a pang of loss, but also a deep sense of pride. He had faced the darkness and won, even at the cost of his own life. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was one of the junior researchers, holding a small box. "Dr. Carter, I found this in Dr. Mercer's office. I thought you might want to have it." She took the box, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, she found Alex's personal notes, a small journal he had kept throughout the ordeal. Flipping through the pages, she saw the meticulous records of his research, his thoughts, his fears. It was a glimpse into his mind, a testament to his dedication and bravery. One entry caught her eye, written in his familiar, hurried scrawl. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it, but know that I did what I had to. Protect them, Lisa. Keep them safe." Tears filled her eyes as she closed the journal, holding it close. She made a silent promise to honor his words, to continue the fight against the unknown threats that lurked in the shadows. Alex's legacy would live on through her and through the work of the Foundation. The facility slowly returned to its routine, the hum of activity resuming. But there was a new resolve, a strengthened commitment to the mission. Alex Mercer's name became a symbol of sacrifice and courage, a reminder of the cost of protecting the world from the darkness. Lisa stood at the entrance to the containment wing, looking back one last time before heading home. She knew the fight was far from over, but she felt ready to face whatever came next. With Alex's memory guiding her, she would continue to protect humanity from the threats that lay hidden in the shadows. As she walked away, the shadows seemed less ominous, the future a little brighter. The battle had been won, and though the cost had been high, it had been worth it. The world was safe, and Alex's sacrifice would ensure it remained so.